"A SEAL medic, why are you here?" Then the Admiral went pale at her scars. She had been dead for 11 minutes before anyone thought to check her pulse again. The waiting room at the Harborview Veterans Employment Center smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of plastic chairs bolted to the floor. Most of the chairs were empty. It was a Tuesday morning in November, and the heat in the building was set just low enough that you could feel the cold coming through the windows if you sat too close to the glass. She sat close to the glass. Her name tag said Maya Reyes. The tag was one of those sticky paper ones the receptionist had printed and handed her without looking up. Maya had pressed it onto her jacket just below the collar, and now it sat slightly crooked, which was the only crooked thing about her. Everything else was still. Her hands rested flat on her knees. Her back did not touch the chair. Her eyes moved across the room in a slow, regular pattern that had nothing to do with reading the motivational posters on the walls and everything to do with the 4 exits she had already located, and the 2 people she had already decided were not a threat. She was wearing dark jeans and a gray fleece and boots that were clean but not new. She looked like someone's older sister, maybe mid-30s. She had the kind of face that did not advertise anything, not warmth, not coldness, just presence. The kind of face that had learned not to give things away. She was there for a job fair, administrative positions, data entry, logistics coordination. The flyer she had found at the library 3 days ago used the word opportunity 4 times. The man sitting next to her had been talking for several minutes. His name was Gerald, and he had worked 22 years in the Navy as a supply officer, and he had opinions about the parking situation outside and about the coffee inside and about the way the form he had just filled out asked for his blood type, which he found invasive. Maya had been listening the way she listened to everything, which was completely, while appearing to be somewhere else. Gerald paused and looked at her form. Then he looked at the boxes she had filled in under previous service. Then he looked at her. She watched him decide not to ask. A woman in a blazer with the Employment Center logo came out of a side door and called the next group into the orientation session. Maya picked up her folder and stood and followed the group down a short hallway and into a conference room where someone had set up a projector that was showing a slide with clip art of a handshake on it. She took a seat near the door. The woman in the blazer was named Denise, and she was trying very hard, and Maya respected that. Denise explained the program. She explained the partnerships with local employers. She explained the resume workshop that would be available after the session. Then she asked everyone to introduce themselves and say one thing they were hoping to get out of today. It went around the table. Gerald said stable hours. A young man named Patrick, who had been a marine mechanic, said benefits. A woman named Jess, who had served in logistics, said just something close to home, honestly. It came to Maya. She said a reason to stay in one place. Nobody asked what she meant. The next person started talking. After the session, Denise pulled her aside in the hallway. She had Maya's paperwork in her hand, and she was looking at it the way people sometimes looked at Maya's paperwork, like maybe there had been a data entry error. "You were in for 14 years, Denise said. Maya said yes. "Special operations support," Denise said. "Medical." Maya said yes. She looked up from the paper. "We have some admin roles. We have a coordinator position at the Port Authority." She paused. "I just want to make sure we're placing you somewhere that's the right fit." Maya understood what Denise was not saying. "I can answer phones," Maya said. Denise smiled in a way that meant she did not know what to do with that information. Maya took the folder with the job listings and walked back to her car, which was a 9-year-old Civic that she had bought in cash 3 months ago when she moved to the city for reasons she had not entirely explained to herself yet. She sat in the car for a moment. Outside, the sky was the color of pewter. Rain was coming. She could smell it through the cracked window, wet concrete and something cold underneath it that meant real weather. She opened the folder. She did not read it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it, let it buzz twice more, then answered. "Yes," she said. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that comes before something unwanted. "Maya," said the voice, "we have a situation." She closed the folder. She already knew, somewhere below her ribs in a place she could not name, that the job fair was over. The voice belonged to a man named Carver. She had not spoken to Carver in 16 months. The last time she had seen him in person was in a trauma bay in a place she was not supposed to name, in a conversation she was not supposed to have on a non-secure line. She had refused an order. He had not argued with her about it. That was the version of events that both of them had agreed to, which meant neither version was the whole truth. He said her name again and gave her a location. a private medical facility on the north end of the harbor, a name she did not recognize, a floor number that suggested it was not the kind of facility that appeared on maps. She said, "I'm not active." He said, "I know." She said, "I don't have credentials here." He said, "I know that too." There was rain now. It came against the windshield in a diagonal that meant the wind had picked up off the water. She could hear it on the roof of the car in that particular hollow way that always made her think of being somewhere higher and more exposed than she was. She said, "Who is the patient?" He said a name. She sat with that for a moment, one breath in, one breath out. The rain hit the windshield and ran down in crooked lines, and she watched those lines. "You have people for this," she said. "Not anymore," he said. That was enough, not because of the name, not because of Carver, because of the word anymore and the thing inside that word that she recognized the way you recognize a smell from years ago. The smell of something that has already gone wrong and is continuing to go wrong and needs someone who can operate inside that wrongness without losing the thread. She started the car. She said, "I'm 20 minutes out." She ended the call before he could say anything that might feel like gratitude or obligation, because both of those things had a way of changing what she did next in ways she could not afford. The facility was a converted warehouse on a pier that had been rebuilt into something that looked, from the outside, like an architectural firm or a private fund. Clean lines, dark glass, a small sign by the entrance that said Harborside Medical Group in letters designed to be forgettable. She had driven past buildings like this before in other cities and never given them a second look, which was the point. She parked and sat for one moment with her hands on the steering wheel. The rain was heavier now. It was the kind of cold that goes through a fleece if you stand in it long enough. She pulled a bag from the back seat. It was a dark green duffel that looked like something you might take to the gym. It was not something you would take to the gym. She went inside. A man in the lobby stood when she entered, young, compact. The stillness in his posture was not the stillness of someone trying to look calm. She nodded at him and he led her to an elevator without speaking and pressed the button for the 5th floor. In the elevator, she could smell antiseptic and beneath it something organic and recent that told her things before she arrived at the room. The doors opened into a corridor lit by long fluorescent panels, the kind of light that makes everything look both brighter and more serious at once. Another man at a desk, older. He looked at her and then at the man who had brought her up and something passed between them. She walked past both of them and followed the smell. The room was at the end of the corridor. Inside there were 3 people. A woman in scrubs who was managing a monitor array. A man in a suit standing against the far wall with his arms crossed in the way that meant he wanted to appear in control of a situation that was not in his control. And on the bed, connected to lines and monitors whose readings she read from the doorway in the time it took her to take one step into the room. A man in his 70s who was the reason Carver had said anymore. She set her bag down on the equipment table beside the bed. The woman in scrubs turned to look at her and opened her mouth. Maya said quietly, "What's his oxygen been doing in the last 20 minutes? The woman in scrubs blinked, then answered, because the question had the sound of a question from someone who already knew what the answer was going to be and needed confirmation of their own reading, and that sound is not something you argue with. His oxygen saturation had dropped twice in the last 20 minutes. Brief drops, both times it had recovered. Both times the woman in scrubs had logged it and watched it and done exactly what her training said to do, which was the problem. Because what her training said to do was the second best option given what Maya was seeing in his face, and his color and the specific pattern of those 2 drops when she looked at the timeline on the monitor. She asked 3 more questions in the same quiet way and moved around the bed and pressed 2 fingers below his jaw and felt the pulse there, felt its cadence, felt the small irregularity inside the regularity that would not show on a standard readout without a longer window. She looked at the monitor, she looked at the IV line, she looked at the bag. Then she looked at the man in the suit. She said, "Who authorized this combination?" The man in the suit said, "I'm sorry, who are you exactly?" She said, "I'm the person who's going to need you to step outside in the next 30 seconds. He did not step outside, he straightened. He had the kind of voice that was used to solving problems by volume and title. "I don't think you understand the chain of authority here," he said. She had already picked up her bag and unzipped the inner pocket and was working with both hands, and the woman in scrubs, to her credit, had moved to the other side of the bed and was ready because she had been watching Maya's hands and not her face, and her hands were very clear. She said to the woman in scrubs, "We're going to need to slow this down and I need you with me on the timing." The woman said yes and meant it. From behind her, the man in the suit was speaking. She heard him. She processed the words. She filed them in the part of her mind that would deal with them later and used the rest of her mind for the thing in front of her, which required everything. There was a quality to working like this that she had never found a word for. It was not calm. It was more like the opposite of scatter. Every sense ran at full capacity, but they did not compete with each other. The cold of the stainless equipment table under her left hand, the smell of the room which had shifted in a way she was tracking, the sound of the monitor and the sound of his breathing, which were two different kinds of information. The specific resistance she felt when she adjusted the line and what that resistance told her. She worked. Outside, through the single window at the end of the corridor, she could hear the rain on the harbor. Inside the room, the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that was almost below hearing. The man in the suit had stopped speaking. She did not know when that had happened. 18 minutes after she walked into the room, the monitor stopped its soft, irregular concern and settled into something that had a different quality. The woman in scrubs made a small sound, not a word, just the involuntary sound of tension leaving a body. Maya stepped back from the bed. Her hands came to rest at her sides. She looked at the readouts for another full minute. She looked at him. She watched his color. She watched his chest. She looked at the lines. Then she began to repack her bag. Behind her, the man in the suit said, "What just happened?" She said, "He's stable." He said, "What did you do?" She did not answer that. She picked up her bag. He said, "I need to know who you are and who authorized your presence here." She said, "Call Carver." She walked to the door. The woman in scrubs said her name, or tried to, because she did not know her name, and said, "Excuse me," and Maya turned. The woman looked at her, then looked at Maya's right forearm where the sleeve of her fleece had pushed up during the last few minutes of work. A long pale scar ran from just below the elbow toward the wrist, not a clean scar, the kind that meant something had happened that could not be fixed cleanly. The woman said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Where did you serve?" Maya pulled the sleeve down. She said, "Here and there." She went back to the elevator. The young man who had brought her up was still in the corridor. He looked at her face and then at the bag, and then he pressed the elevator button without her asking. Going down the elevator was slow. The building had the kind of silence that a building has when everything above a certain floor is supposed to be somewhere else on paper. The lobby was empty except for the first young man who had stood when she came in. He was seated again now. He watched her cross the lobby and she watched him watching her, and when she pushed through the glass door, the cold air off the harbor came at her full on, wet and sharp, and carrying the smell of salt water and diesel, and the specific cold of a city built on water in late autumn. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The rain had dropped to a mist that was not quite rain and not quite fog, but something between the two that settled on everything and made the lights of the harbor blur at their edges. Her phone buzzed. "Carver." She answered. He said, "The Admiral wants to meet you." She said, "I don't think that's a good idea." He said, "He's asking personally." She stood there for a moment with the harbor mist coming down and the sound of water moving under the pier somewhere below her feet and the cold of the railing she had put her hand on seeping through her palm. She said, "Which Admiral?" He said the name. She said nothing for a long time. She had been 14 years old the first time she had heard that name. It was in a different context than this one. It was in a hospital waiting room in Coronado, California in the summer, in a waiting room with chairs that were also bolted to the floor, waiting for news about her father, and a man in uniform had come in and spoken to her mother, and used that name in a sentence that had changed the direction of several things. She said, "When?" Carver said, "Tomorrow morning." She said, "Send me the details." She ended the call. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat and the windows fogged slowly from her breath, and she sat in that small fog for a while and did not start the car. On the seat next to her, the folder from the employment center was still there, the job listings, the handshake clip art on the cover sheet. She picked it up and looked at it, then she set it back down. She thought about the waiting room that morning, the burnt coffee, Gerald talking about blood type, the crooked name tag she had stuck below her collar, the word opportunity used 4 times. She thought about the man on the bed, the way his color had shifted. The sound of his breathing at minute 3 versus minute 17, the specific tension she could feel in the line when she adjusted it, things you learn and cannot unlearn and cannot explain to someone who has not stood in those rooms. She thought about the woman in scrubs looking at her scar and not asking the real question. She started the car. The heater came on slowly, and the fog on the windows began to clear from the bottom up in a way that reminded her of a lot of things clearing. She pulled out of the parking spot and turned toward the harbor road, and the lights of the city moved in the wet air around her. In the morning, she would go to the meeting. She knew that before she started the car. She had known it before Carver called, in the way that she sometimes knew things in that place below her ribs that did not give reasons, only directions. But tonight she drove. The city came and went in the mist, light and dark and light again. She kept both hands on the wheel and she watched the road, and she did not think about the name the Admiral had asked to use when they met, which was not the name on the sticky paper name tag that was still stuck slightly crooked to her jacket. She reached up and peeled it off. She set it on the dashboard, Maya Reyes in small printed letters. She looked at it while a red light held her at an empty intersection at 11:30 at night, with the rain coming back and the city quiet in the way a city gets quiet when it thinks no one is watching. The light changed. She drove.